Welcome to Stories with Liz. I just love Guy De Maupassant's beautiful stories. This one is called Love and was first released in 1886. Love. Being pages from a sportsman's notebook. I have just been reading in a newspaper the story of a love tragedy. He killed her, then he killed himself. Therefore, he loved her. What do he or she signify to me? Alone, it is only their love that matters. And it does not interest me in the least because it touches me, or because it amazes me, or because it moves me, or because it makes me think, but only because it brings back to my mind a memory of the days of my youth, a curious sporting experience, when love shone out before me like crosses used to shine in the sky for early Christians. I have by nature within me all the instincts and feelings of primitive man, tempered by the humaner understanding of civilized being. I am passionately devoted to sport, but the bleeding victim, the blood on the feathers of a bird, harrow my feelings and almost make me faint with horror. About the end of the autumn of the year I have in mind, the cold weather suddenly set in, and I was invited by one of my cousins, Carl de Reville, to shoot duck with him at daybreak over the marshes. My cousin, a jolly red-headed and big-bearded, immensely powerful fellow of 40, a lively and likable sort of beast, who had within him just that pinch of Attic salt which makes mediocrity tolerable, lived the life of a country gentleman in a house which was half farm, half mansion, in a broad valley through which a river floated. Woods covered the hills on either side, ancient ancestral woods with magnificent trees, in which were to be found more rare examples of game birds than in any other district close by. Sometimes eagles were shot, and birds flying south which hardly ever came near over populated parts of the country almost invariably used to break their journey when they came to these countries' old trees, as if they knew and saw once more a little corner of a very old forest, which still existed to give them shelter through their short night's rest. The valley was covered with huge pastures, irrigated by ditches and divided by hedges. The river, narrow at first, spread out at some little distance away into an immense marsh. This marsh, the best bit of the shooting I've ever known, was my cousin's very special care, and he looked after it as he would a park. Narrow avenues had been cut through the great masses of reeds which covered it, and whose rustling and swaying seemed to make it alive. And along these passages floated fat-bottomed boats, propelled and steered with poles, silently passed over the still water, gazing the rushes, while fishes darted through the weeds, and windfowl, with their black and pointed heads, dived and vanished in a flash. I love water passionately and wholeheartedly. The sea, although it is too vast, too turbulent, impossible to call one's own, rivers, which are so pretty, but which hurry by and vanish forever, but above all, the water of marshes, in which there throbs all the unknown lives of birds, beasts, and fishes. A marsh is a world of its own upon this earth of ours, a different world, with its own habits, its fixed population, and its people who come and go, its voices, its sounds, its essentiality, its mystery. There is at times nothing more disturbing, more disquieting, more terrifying than bogland. Whence comes this fear which hovers over the low-lying tracts of lands covered with water? Is it in the whispering of the reeds, the will-o'-the-wisps, the deep silence in which they are wrapped on still nights, or the fantastic mists which cover the rushes as with a shroud, or the barely noticeable noises, so light, so gentle, yet at times more terrifying than the thunder of man and gods. Do these give marshes the appearance of some dreamland or of some dread country which hides some secret, harmful and not to be known by mortal man? No, something else stands forth clearly. Another and deeper, more solemn mystery is floating in those dense mists, perhaps even the mystery of creation. For did not the first germ of life stir and become restless and come into being in stagnant and muddy water, in the heavy damp and land streaming under the burning sun? I arrived at my cousin's house in the evening. It was freezing hard enough to split stones. During dinner, in the great hall, whose sideboards, walls, and ceilings were all covered with stuffed birds with outstretched wings or perched upon branches, hawks, herons, owls, nightjars, buzzards, vultures, falcons, my cousin himself, like some strange animal of the Arctic region, in his sealskin jacket, put before me all the plans he had made for this very night. We were to leave at 3:30 in the morning, as to arrive about 4:30 at the place chosen for our shooting expedition. At this place a hut had been constructed out of blocks of ice to shelter us a little from the terrible wind which rises just before dawn, that wind laden with an iciness which tears one's flesh as with a saw, cuts it with the blade of a sword, pricks it as with poisoned goads, twists it as with red-hot pincers, and scorches it as with fire. My cousin, rubbing his hands, said, "I have never felt such frost. At 6 this evening it was already 12 degrees below zero." Immediately after dinner I threw myself on my bed and went off to sleep by the light of a great fire blazing in the grate. As 3 o'clock struck, I was awakened. I put on a sheepskin and found my cousin Carl clothed in a bearskin. After 2 cups of hot coffee and a couple of glasses of cognac, we set out with our gamekeeper and our dogs, Plajon and Pierrot. The moment I got outside, I felt frozen to the bone. It was one of those nights when the earth seemed to be frozen to death. The icy air rises before one as a veritable wall, which one can feel horribly and painfully. No breath of wind moves it. There it is, solid and immovable. It bites, pierces, withers, kills trees, plants, insects, even little birds, which fall from the branches to the hard ground, and themselves become hard in the embrace of the cold. The moon, in its last quarter, all pale, appeared to be dying in the mists of space, so weak that it could not move and was standing still upon there, paralyzed in the clutch of the bitter sky. It shed a thin and melancholy light upon the world below, the pale and dying beam which it casts every month as it wanes. With bent backs, hands in pockets, and guns over our arms, Carl and I strode along. Our boots, wrapped around with wool to prevent us slipping on the frozen brooks, made no noise. I noticed how our dog's breath turned to steam in the cold air. We soon reached the edge of the marsh, and we entered one of the avenues of dry reeds leading through the low forest. A soft sound came from the long ribbon-like leaves as we brushed them aside, and I was suddenly seized for the first time by the powerful and strange sensation which boglands produce in me. This one was dead, frozen to death, for we were tramping over it through its forest of dried-up rushes. Suddenly, at the bend of one of the avenues, I saw the hut made of ice which had been set up as a shelter for us. I went in, and as we still had an hour to pass before the birds awakened, I rolled myself up in my sheepskin to keep the warmth. Lying on my back, I began to watch the misshapen moon shining mistily through the transparent walls of the icy house, but the cold of the frozen marshland, of those walls of earth and sky without, soon went through me so horribly that I began to cough. My cousin Carl was alarmed. "It will be a great nuisance if we don't shoot anything today," he said. "I don't want you to catch a cold, so we must have a fire." He then ordered the gamekeeper to cut some reeds. They made a pile in the center of the hut with its top knocked off to let the smoke escape. And as the red flame licked up the crystal-like walls, they began to melt, quietly, almost imperceptibly, just as if the ice bricks were sweating. Carl, who had remained outside, called to me, "Come and look." I went out and stood for a moment completely lost in amazement. Our cone-shaped hut seemed like some enormous diamond with a heart of fire thrust suddenly onto the frozen marsh. Within there were seen two fantastical shapes, our dogs warming themselves. Then a strange, frightening, wandering cry was heard over our heads. Our fire was awakening the wildfowl. To me, there is nothing more affecting than the first cry of some absolutely invisible living thing hurrying through the dark air so swiftly and so far away, just before there appears on the horizon the earliest light of a winter's day. At that freezing hour of dawn, I can imagine that the faint cry borne on the wings of a bird is a sigh escaping from the soul of the world. Carl said, "Put out the fire. Dawn is breaking." Certainly the sky began to grow pale, and across it flocks of ducks made long, black, quickly disappearing streaks. A flash of light blazed through the darkness. Carl had just fired, and the dogs sped forwards. Then, no minute went by without one of us quickly taking aim as soon as the outline of some flying mass appeared above the reeds, and Pierrot and Plajon, out of breath and happy, brought us bleeding creatures whose eyes sometimes still looked at us. Day broke, clear with blue sky. The sun came up over the bottom of the valley, and we were thinking of going home when two birds, with necks and wings outstretched, suddenly glided over our heads, and I fired. And one of them, a steel with a silver breast, fell almost at my feet. Then, high above me, a cry of the survivor of the two was heard, a little heart-rending wail, which it uttered again and again. And the little creature began to circle round in the blue sky above us, watching its dead companion, which I was holding. Carl, on one knee, his gun at his shoulder, was watching it keenly, waiting till it came within range. "You have killed the hen," he said. "The cock won't go away." Indeed, it did not go away, but continued to circle and to cry piteously over our heads. Never has the groan of one in pain harrowed my heart so much as that call of distress, as that wail of reproach from the poor creature high up in the sky. Once or twice it fled as it saw the thread of the gun which followed its flight, and it seemed prepared to continue its journey across the sky all alone. Then, as if unable to make up its mind, it would instead return to look for its companion. "Put the other one down, and it will return by and by," said Carl. In truth, it came back, indifferent to danger, maddened by its wild love for the creature which I had killed. Carl fired. It was as if the cord which was holding the bird above us had been cut. I saw a black thing come down. I heard the noise of its fall in the reeds, and Pierrot brought it to me. I put the two, already cold, into the same bag, and went back to Paris that very day. The end. What a beautiful story. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you next week for a different type of story. Have a good week till then. Bye.